Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. Before I hand it over to my panelists, I just wanted to set the stage so you know what we will be discussing. So this panel will discuss the issue of vulnerability reporting, focused particularly on the regulatory mandates concerning premature disclosure of vulnerabilities to governments. There are a bunch of requirements already in place, a lot already coming on the horizon. So it's super important for companies and businesses to be aware of what these requirements entail. I'm honored to get to work with Michael, Katie, and Rob, who will set the scene for this conversation and discuss the implications of premature disclosure to governments. So without further ado, Rob, you want to start us off?
Sure. Hi there. I'm Rob Spiger. It's such a pleasure to be here at VulnCon, and this is my first conference of this type. So thank you for everybody being so warm and friendly, and I'm always amazed by the level of expertise that's here. I represent Microsoft, and I'm on the global cybersecurity policy team at Microsoft.
Hi, my name is Michael Woolslayer. I'm a policy counsel at HackerOne. As you could probably tell by my title, I am a lawyer, so I apologize in advance to hold it against me. And this is my only disclaimer. This isn't legal advice. I'm here in policy capacity. So consult your own legal counsel if you have any questions about what we say here. Thank you again for inviting us. So really looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Noble. I am Director of Product Security, Incident Response, and Bug Bounty at Intel Corporation. I'm also a member of the Hacking Policy Council. So my background I was in the government for 15 years and ran a lot of the programs you're familiar with. So like the CVE program, NBD, Carnegie Mellon CERT CC, and ICS CERT. So I've coordinated about 20,000 cybersecurity vulnerabilities in my career. So that's my perspective.
Thanks, everyone. To just start off the conversation, quick softball question. Rob, why don't you start us off? What is a vulnerability? How is it different from an incident? And are there different types of vulnerabilities?
So this seemed like a really good question last week, but after having attended the conference, it's probably a suicide mission. I think vulnerability is something where it's a difference between what the security intention was of the product and the behavior it exhibits. Often it's associated with something that degrades the confidentiality or integrity or availability of a product and how it's used. And I think the key thing is, though, you'll often see regulators sort of lump three different things together, and that is vulnerability reporting, incident reporting, and the sharing of threat intelligence. All of those are beneficial activities to increase cybersecurity defense, but I think they all require different treatment for how regulators view them. The vulnerability reporting obviously indicates information about vulnerabilities that could be exploited if it hasn't been mitigated yet. Incident reporting is good for information sharing because it allows an organization to share experience they've had trying to use ICT products that maybe hasn't gone as well as they expected, so others can learn from that lesson and be aware of what's going on. And then threat intelligence is really something where companies often invest money to have better insights about what's going on for threat actors and their activities and how those relate to products and companies. And it's a situation where if you just mandate it has to be reported for free, you might stop that investment from happening and lessen the accuracy of information that they're able to collect and provide. And so hopefully that's a good description of it. In terms of, what the impact of vulnerabilities are, I mean, this is obviously a very humbling place to talk about that. I think, there is a challenge, though, for companies in terms of how do they predict what might happen with any given vulnerability and how should they respond to it accordingly. And I think that's how a lot of the regulations need to think more about the severity of vulnerabilities and what the right next steps are for them.
Anyone want to add?
I will add one thing just to add a little bit more context. So all of us here, Tanvi, all of us are on a group called the Hacking Policy Council. And what that group does is it aims to influence regulation standards and kind of industry norms to build positive relationships within the cybersecurity community. So everything we do is aimed at improving the way that policymakers make laws so that it has a positive impact on the researcher community, the hacker community, cybersecurity defenders. That's the perspective that we're taking. So we do a lot of work specifically in that realm. So when we talk about that, keep in mind that that's really the focus that we're coming from.
Michael and I talked a little before this panel, and we were going to do a lot of +1 to what she said. So I'm just going to do that here.
I thought maybe this was a good time to just say it.
So just in that line of questioning, then, Michael, do you want to go over what is vulnerability disclosure and what's the top priority of it as well?
Sure. Thanks. So as many of you know, at its most basic form, vulnerability disclosure is reporting or providing information about a security flaw in software or hardware that someone has discovered and then reported to usually the vendor, but it can take different forms. Again, as many of you probably already know, that many of the most common forms, there's responsible disclosure in which the discoverer of the vulnerability reports it to the vendor and gives them a reasonable timeline in which to mitigate that vulnerability and then makes details public after that. There's a variation on that, which is coordinated vulnerability disclosure, which is where the reporter and the vendor work together in order to fix the vulnerability and come up with a timeline for which that information can be made public. Coordinated vulnerability disclosure sometimes also involves a third party, as the CERT, that could be a trusted intermediary in that process. And then there are other forms of disclosure, full disclosure, where somebody discovers a vulnerability and makes that information public immediately, is one other variation. What we're seeing is that coordinated vulnerability disclosure is becoming the most common type of vulnerability disclosure that we see popping up in regulations and in laws. Here we see it in Article 12 of NIS 2. We see it in Article 10 of the, at some point to be formally adopted, European Union CRA. And the whole point of vulnerability disclosure is to reduce risk to end users. So whatever form it takes, that is usually the end goal of vulnerability disclosure in an ideal world.
Okay. So what about vulnerability reporting then? Why are governments increasingly requiring companies to report vulnerabilities to them?
Okay.
Yes.
So I did work in the government for 15 years. As I said previously, I worked at CISA for a very long time. Before CISA was CISA, I worked at CISA. So there is a overall kind of push within the last, I would say, 10 years to adopt coordinated vulnerability disclosure. Ultimately, bug bounty is another way that that's kind of being adopted throughout the community. We did see this as a big push in 2015 with the Hack the Pentagon effort. That was a real watershed moment because it took the U.S. government, specifically the DoD, and said DoD is willing to not only work with hackers, but work and pay hackers and open up their networks to say, like, we've done everything that we can to secure this networks. Give it your worst and tell us what you can get. And I think that after that push, we really started to see governments sort of change the way that they think about working cooperatively with the researcher community. So the U.S. government has put a lot of time and effort into building positive relationships with the researcher community. So CISA has done an amazing job. And at any given point, the perception used to be, don't talk to the government. The government's going to send the FBI and you're going to get arrested, right? That was the big fear. But recently, in the last, I would say 5 to 8 years, the push has been quite a bit different. It's, you need help, we'll go to CISA. CISA will help you. Says you've got a problem with a vendor who's saying, as a researcher perspective, you've got a problem with a vendor who's saying they're going to take legal action against you. We'll go to CISA. CISA will help you coordinate that issue to get it fixed, right? No one's gonna send lawyers after CISA. So there really has been sort of a big change. We're also starting to see a lot of regulations, which I think are good intended, but don't quite understand the words that they're saying, which is a little bit sad. And so there are a lot of efforts that go to try to help policymakers become more literate in the cybersecurity ecosystem. So it's good intended. And if you were to ask, say, 10 years ago, any congressman in the US, on the Hill, about, what is TCP/IP, they would have absolutely no idea. What is AI? They would have absolutely no idea. But now you can actually, for the most part, there's initiatives like Tech Congress where you have companies who send people to go do a year to help a congressional member get literate on cybersecurity, right? So there are a lot of good intended initiatives that have come a long way to helping policymakers become more capable of having good conversations about cybersecurity. We're not there yet, though. So what's happened is we have a lot of policy that's good intended, but it may not be using the right language. And so that language has to be worked out a little bit better. So we're seeing a lot of regulations that start out with researchers or vendors must disclose to X government agency, right? That may not be the right way to do it until that vulnerability has been mitigated and patched. We can have a philosophical discussion about it at any point. In my opinion, it's not necessarily the right way to do that. Let me take a breath here. Because I think if you do that, you're creating what we refer to as a buggy bank. You're creating a central repository of vulnerability information that has not yet been patched. And so that is a huge, huge risk. So I think these regulations and policies and standards are very well intended, but I think that there is more work to be done to get the words matter, and the words have to be intelligent and comprehensive and timely and evergreen, and they're just not quite there yet. So we have some more work to do.
And I would just say, to build off what Katie said, the distinction we're going to be making throughout the panel is between vulnerability disclosure, which everybody here is very much in favor of, and vulnerability reporting requirements, which are these well-intended regulations that don't always have the effect.
And I think it's really important to call out who we're talking about reporting to and by whom, right? I think the security researcher to the manufacturer or third-party coordinator is something we're all behind. But when you try to bypass that process and require security researchers to report to government agencies or require manufacturers to report to the government prior to having mitigations available, that sort of disrupts the equities process that a manufacturer that's responsible takes very seriously to think about what the impact of the vulnerability information being disclosed would be on their customers and how to best kind of deal with the different stakeholders involved and what the right time is to go public. Maybe that's before mitigations are available in the rare circumstances, but having reporting to the government be injected into the process that didn't exist before raises a lot of complexities that I don't feel a lot of the regulations have really sought to address. I think that's why we're trying to share this risk with you all as stakeholders that are in this community and have an ability to reach out to different counterparts in the governments you work with and try to better define what these new policies might be and what they're trying to achieve and the best way to do that.
So we're requiring these security researchers to report to government agencies. What are these government agencies then doing with those reports? Anyone can answer, please, all of you.
It depends. It's a horrible answer, but it does depend on the government agency. Well, it depends on the government, I guess. So in China, there was a really good talk yesterday by an individual from the Atlantic Council. If you haven't seen his talk yesterday, I think it's being recorded, so you should take a look at it. So he specifically went into the China law that requires the government or the researchers report to the vendor and also the Chinese government before that vulnerability has been mitigated. And he outlined several of the things that we were always afraid of, but now we're actually seeing them. And that's the fact that we believe that those vulnerabilities are being weaponized and used against adversaries. So that is the potential negative, like nuclear option, potential negative. There are some much more benevolent governments who are honestly just trying to get that information so that they can work with their stakeholders and develop mitigations. with the US government, I can't speak for the US government anymore, but I know that any information that was disclosed to CISA was not meant to be used for any offensive operations. And in fact, there's a program called the Vulnerabilities Equities Process. That's a White House-led initiative, started in about 2013 from the Sony hack, and it weighs the national intelligence collection against US defense, basically. And it says if the US government is aware of a vulnerability that could be used offensively, is there a responsibility for the US government to report that vulnerability to the vendor so the vendor could patch it, but thereby eliminating their ability, the US government's offensive abilities to use that vulnerability as a weapon against adversaries. That is a program that does exist. And the vast majority of the vulnerabilities that go into the VEP are disclosed to the vendor. But there are multiple different parties in the VEP. So I will say that there is a segregation, and if nothing else, the turf war saves us, because US government agencies often don't like each other. And so I'm sure that's how it works in other countries as well. But any vulnerability that's identified, and you can probably go find the charter and quote me on it, it's on page 9 of the charter in the bottom, the VEP charter. It says any vulnerability identified through the course of incident response or security research, which is intended for disclosure, is not subject to VEP. So that means that any vulnerability that is identified and reported to CISA as a defensive agency does not make it into VEP, which means those vulnerabilities are never used offensively by any other national intelligence agency within the United States government. So I think that's a positive way to put a good set of boundaries on intelligence collection and production, and vulnerability coordination and disclosure from a defensive and offensive position.
And to just build on that and take the example of the CRA that's coming through the EU. Right now, it appears that the intention is for any reporting on unmitigated vulnerabilities to go into a centralized database that is accessible by each member state organization as well as ANISA. And so we're not quite sure what that implementation will look like, but that seems to be the intent of the current language. The other thing that we have flagged as the Hacking Policy Council and others in the community, that we have flagged that there is no language in the CRA that explicitly rejects the ability of other agencies of these member state governments to access that information for any other purposes. So that does raise the potential for this information, or at least the temptation that this information is eventually accessed for intelligence or surveillance purposes. Again, we don't know that is currently the intention of the drafters. We assume they have very good intentions to improve cybersecurity, but there will be that temptation if it's implemented as the language currently stands.
And I think for the CRA, I've also heard feedback from the governments that on one hand, they're interested in sort of resolving the information asymmetry, where the vendor knows more about vulnerabilities in their products than the government does. They are also interested in making sure that manufacturers follow through on obligations to do product support, and knowing about the vulnerabilities might give them better insight to be able to track that. And then also they're ultimately interested in making sure users are informed of the vulnerabilities after they're resolved. And, perhaps knowing about the vulnerability early is going to help them be able to help facilitate and accelerate that process. So those are some other good things we've heard. They've also, I think, are conflicted around information sharing, like protection of critical infrastructure. They'll know about a vulnerability that may be used in critical infrastructure, and they're not quite sure yet how they're going to use that information. And maybe that's why they haven't restricted its use in what they've put in the legislation so far. They're still kind of planning to experiment with what they'll do. But, if you're familiar with CVD processes today, having somebody that may not be bound to the trust relationship you have with the other participants in the CVD process is a concerning thing, and that they may inform stakeholders. And the larger that set of stakeholders is, the more likely malicious actors might find out about it. So there was
a really good article a couple of years ago. I believe it was by Lawfare blog, but they were talking about, and I cannot remember the last word, but it's like the lowest cost resolver, I think. What is it? Art? least cost avoider, right? So the least cost avoider is the person who is the closest to that product, right? Is the person who should be responsible for fixing that product, because that reduces the overall risk for everyone else in the entire process. So that means that if an owner operator or developer or vendor is the person who is responsible for building that product, they're the ones that should have access to fixing that product. And as you incorporate multiple different parties into that loop, every round that you incorporate more and more people, you increase the risk more and more that there's going to be an uncoordinated disclosure or a breach of embargo, which could put it provides an adversarial advantage, and it reduces the advantage for the defenders to patch that issue before it becomes an incident. Yeah, good. Do you need a mic though? It's being recorded to you.
Yeah. I don't care, but I want us to go through. Now hold on. Okay. Least cost avoider is great. It applies to many more things than cybersecurity. CRA required vulnerability reporting. I may have lost track of whatever the most recent version of the language is, so I'm searching and can't find it. But my last read, and to the best of my recollection, which may have failed me, the requirement, I mean, the must or shall language I recall was a software producer must, system producer must, product producer report exploited vulnerabilities. Must report exploited vulnerabilities through, I forget the process, it's up to the EU and then maybe out to the member states. My understanding is not exploited vulnerabilities were left undefined, maybe a should, just not a requirement. So I've had discussions with some other folks, and to me, exploited vulnerability sort of equals incident. And now I might call that an incident reporting clause and not have named it a vulnerability reporting clause. Exploited vulnerability sounds like something you do want to move quickly on, and I might take the chance of sharing it widely with all the member states quickly at the cost of maybe someone else finding out about it. It's being exploited. Otherwise, if it's not being exploited, I share the concerns already expressed that disclosing a secret to more people is putting the secret at risk. But the question, sorry, is do you know the distinction about exploited vulnerability versus just vulnerability? Thank you.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. The CRA requires manufacturers to report actively exploited vulnerabilities. It was an early warning in 24 hours and a report within 72 hours. And I think the challenge around actively exploited is how it's defined. And in some earlier versions, it wasn't clear that that required malicious intent. It just required malicious code that ran without the system owner's permission. I think there are quite a few versions of the CRA floating around. The latest one I saw was from the middle of March. And it had reporting going to ANISA and then proliferate into the CSIRTs after that, which is a slight change from the version earlier in the year. So, as the gentleman from ANISA noted, I think it was yesterday morning, the CRA isn't quite final yet, but around the requirement to report actively exploited vulnerabilities, sure, it is a concern if it's actively exploited, but in the absence of mitigations, the question is, what would customers do with that information? And in some cases too, we have seen sometimes sophisticated nation-state adversaries take a vulnerability, they use it, and they exploit a very small number of targets. And once they're aware that vulnerability is known by the manufacturer and remediation processes are in play, they may scale out their use of that vulnerability to maximize its benefit prior to the mitigations being available and applied. So I don't think it's a slam dunk that when it's actively exploited, it should be widely communicated. There could be situations where active exploitation kicks off a process to remediate it without tipping off the adversary that that's known. And so, I would just use caution there around it. It is at the surface level, potentially a benefit to do disclosure when it is actively exploited, but manufacturers still have the ability outside of the regulation to issue a security advisory anyway, right? And I think we've seen that process happen in many cases where even though there isn't a mitigation due to active exploitation, the vendor says, hold on, there's something terrible going on here. We're not ahead of it. please take action and mitigations on your own before we have something we could publish as a patch.
I think so. Art, I think you keyed in on the loophole big enough to drive a freight train through. And as I was saying earlier about good intended but bad language choices, because actively exploited vulnerability in my lexicon is an incident. And a lot of this works well if you're a service vendor, a SaaS vendor, somebody who has a feedback loop, but it doesn't work well if you're a tier 1 provider. As a tier 1 provider, you sell to an OEM, and that OEM integrates your product into their device, who then sells that on. So imagine this like Home Depot, right, or any gardening store or whatever you'd like to choose. A vendor sells bricks to Home Depot, and you buy the bricks from Home Depot, but the vendor doesn't know whether you use those bricks to build your foundation or line your driveway. And the risk is different. And there's no way that the vendor's ever going to know how you used their product in their network, because you don't report back to the vendor how you use their product. And this is how it works in a lot of tier 1 hardware companies and industrial control systems. There's not a feedback loop. So if you're a SaaS portal, sure, yeah, you have a feedback. You can tell if there's actively exploited vulnerabilities. However, if you're not, which a lot of the cybersecurity industry is not, how are you to know that there is a vulnerability that's being actively exploited? And that becomes a loophole big enough to drive a freight train through. And this is an example of good intent and the language not quite matching up to the industry standard in a way that's communicated effectively and communicated in a valuable way to provide the defender actionable information to take action. I think I just used action way too many times, but it's okay. You understood.
And just to follow up on a point that Rob made around the malicious intent and the definition of actively exploited vulnerability, as Rob noted, there have been some versions of the CRA that do have that limitation and some that don't. Right now, there seems to be language in the recitals at the beginning of the CRA that state, obviously, we don't mean a result of good faith security research or defensive action as being an actively exploited vulnerability. But then when you look, that again, that recital language at the front is not binding. And what is binding are the definitions, which no longer have that malicious intent qualification. So that's why we're just raising some concerns. Obviously, we know the CRA is not in a final form yet and may change again, but these are some of the issues that we're.
I thought you weren't going to do that legal stuff. So,
not legal advice.
One other thing to add to your comment, you know, the fact that a vulnerability is actively exploited becomes an incident. I think it's important to think about who is required to report an incident. Is it the product manufacturer that's required to report that a customer that uses their product has experienced an incident? Or is it the customer's responsibility to report that they have had an incident? I think it's better if the party that's affected is the one doing the reporting, as opposed to a manufacturer sort of spying on their customers and divulging when they've had incidents, because they may not always know if availability or something like that is a case where the customer actually has redundancy. Maybe they're using, you know, 2 different cloud providers and one is down due to vulnerability, but the other means all their services are fine. So just keep that in mind too. Great question though.
Just in the same lane of questions, talk me through what it's like dealing with a vulnerability, an exploited vulnerability early on. Katie, I know you have a lot of experience with this, but again, this question is open to everyone. Let's say that you're one day after a malicious actor has exploited a vulnerability. What do you know? What are you working on? Who is helping you? What's your bandwidth like? And then let's go over not just the vulnerability response aspect, but also the vulnerability reporting aspect to it.
Right. So I work on the PSIRT side of the house versus the CSIRT side of the house. So most of my knowledge on CSIRT, which is really your incident responding, if there's been an incident, that side of the house, I can talk from a theoretical perspective. PSIRT, I can talk from a practical perspective. So I'll go with what I know. So we receive vulnerabilities. Intel Corporation, like most other companies, receives vulnerabilities through a front door. They come either from a security researcher, an academic institution, a friendly helper, which is somebody like a national CERT, or even another company that may have found a vulnerability in one of our products, and they send them over to us. And also the vulnerabilities also come from our internal teams. So they all get routed into the same basic funnel. They get triaged. So that triage often takes at least a couple of days to go through and triage and say, is this actually real? Is the source credible? And is the information technologically feasible? That's your first level triage. Then vulnerabilities gets bounced to the product team. So it's like a massive treasure hunt inside a multinational organization. So what is this product? Is this product actually, is this is it really the product? So is it an overall CPU or is it an ingredient in a CPU? Is it a BIOS or is it like one part of the actual, is it a silicon issue? What is the actual thing here? And sometimes you may find that a vulnerability in one ingredient impacts multiple ingredients. Think of this like car headlights, right? So you may have a car and it has this kind of headlights, but that manufacturer may have used that kind of headlights in lots of different kinds of cars. So if there's a recall, it's actually going to be on lots of different kinds of cars rather than just that one. So once we identify, this takes days to identify because you have to go through and do a lot of due diligence and understanding what the issue is and how it actually impacts CIA. If it is found to be a legitimate vulnerability versus a functional issue, it then gets routed to the product team to be taken on full time. The product team who owns that product, the least cost avoider, goes through and develops a mitigation. That's the patch. Once that mitigation has been developed, usually before this, the product security engineer communicates with the researcher and lets them know what's going on. That's when they communicate the mitigation timelines and say, this is going to be disclosed in 45 days, 90 days, whatever. So that information, once the patch has been created, the mitigation has been deployed, the vulnerability is then disclosed. This is the no one says anything till everyone says everything. The vulnerability goes out, CVE gets issued, and we all pat each other on the back and move on to the next pile of drama we have to deal with. So that whole process can take a very, very long time. Depending on the severity of the issue, it can be something, and depending on whether it's a SaaS, software, hardware, or firmware issue, it can be escalated, it can be de-escalated. Almost everyone has an internal kind of temporal, which is what you should be using for CVSS. You should be looking at environmental and temporal because that gives you a how fast, it gives you a prioritization rather than just a severity. CVSS only gives you severity in a vacuum. If you use the other elements of the CVSS scoring system, then you get priority, and that helps you identify how fast it should be fixed. If it's a critical issue, obviously it gets moved to the front of the pile. However, little caveat there, a lot of issues that result in massive breaches are not critical issues. They tend to be things that are like 4.9 or 5. So it becomes very skewed, and it's up to each organization how they implement that. So that's sort of the process for product security side. For an incident, it runs a lot faster. As soon as there is a breach identified, it goes through the SOC and it happens much, much, much faster. There is also a reporting requirement. So the company is required to report to the FTC if there's been an incident. And that I cannot speak to, so I probably won't. And at this point, I will hand over to my other panel members.
So thank you, Katie, for outlining that process. What we're looking at here as well is the potential burden of these vulnerability reporting requirements. So I'm again going to use what we are aware of is currently in the CRA as an example. So you're going through all these processes, trying to figure out what's going on, who's responsible, what product is it in, what element of the product is it in, et cetera, et cetera. Well, as we just had the conversation about the definition of actively exploited vulnerability, which then triggers this vulnerability reporting requirement within the first 24 hours. So you learn about a potentially actively exploited vulnerability, and now you have 24 hours to determine, is that actually an actively exploited vulnerability based upon the definition in the CRA? Is it a false positive? You have to track down who may be testing, maybe doing something on a defensive capacity that has triggered those alarms. So in the CRA, you have 24 hours to come up to make a report that there is an actively exploited vulnerability. And then you also have to report all the member states in the EU that product is available in. So depending on the size and the complexity of your organization, that might be itself a heavy lift to figure out just those two basic pieces of information. Then within 72 hours, you have to provide a more detailed report to ENISA under the CRA, and that needs to include general information: what product is affected, the nature of the exploit and vulnerability, any mitigations that you're currently working on, and any potential mitigations that a user can put in place. And again, that's within 72 hours of becoming aware of an actively exploited vulnerability. And then about 30 days after that, you need to provide an even more detailed report whether or not a mitigation has been put in place. Though again, that within 30 days reporting piece has been changing in the different versions of the CRA, so we won't know exactly what that means. But so when you're thinking about all the steps that are already occurring, and then you layer on the added burden of trying to figure out if this is an actively exploited vulnerability that triggers this reporting requirement, who's going to be filing those reports on your team? It's probably, hopefully not the folks dealing with the technical issue, but the people who have to file this on behalf of your organization are going to be coming to you to get the answers to all these questions. So that's going to be an added burden on you and your team. And then you have these compressed timelines by which you have to provide much more detailed information than you may have available, given how long these processes can take.
Yeah, unfortunately, the CRA does have some provision for small organizations to not have to do the 24-hour notification, but the 72-1 is across the board. I think the other thing that's concerning too is, sure, you might just report and then think you're done, but there's also an ability for the CSIRT to come back and ask the manufacturer more details about an incident. And as you can imagine, if you have something that's important to fix, but it doesn't have mitigations, you're going to end up with a lot of questions about when is the mitigation coming, and that could serve as a distraction from the incident response team as well.
I'll also just add, like, oftentimes when reports are provided in the very beginning, they're not clean, right? So they're not a perfect proof of concept. So a lot of times that initial person who's doing the intake and triage, the initial triage, they're trying to sort out what did that researcher what were they trying to say? So they're trying to replicate the proof of concept. And oftentimes they have to go back and forth to the security researcher and get additional information. You know, were you on version 1 or version 1.1? And then so there's a time lag there. So you may be on the West Coast and the person who's reporting may be in Poland. And so your day is their night. And so you ask the question, you get the report in, you ask the question, you know, are you on version 1 or version 1.1? Because I can't replicate this vulnerability. And they go, crickets. And then when they wake up in the morning, maybe they see your question. Maybe they don't. Maybe they have a day job. And so you're just sitting there waiting, trying to figure it out. So that's already a day wasted. That's 24 hours. You've already are supposed to have reported at that point. You can't even replicate the vulnerability yet. So there's a lot of pieces that go into it that are not really accounted for in the real world. Just to kind of highlight that additional kind of burden, you have a lot of well-intended regulations that are not taking into account the realistic implications of what they're saying.
You know, looking at the way incident reporting has gone, well, incident reporting can be a really positive thing. I think we're seeing more and more proliferation of regulations in the incident reporting space that have different thresholds and different timelines, and that really complicates it. Like, is this a product? Is this an incident that affected customers in India? Is this an incident that caused a certain amount of downtime? Is it an incident that has a material impact on the company? Those things are really hard to identify in the first 6, 24, 72 hours. And so if we see the same trend for vulnerability reporting, it's going to become even more burdensome on the incident responders to try to deal with what are all these different thresholds and timelines and reports that need to get sent out to different regulations in different countries. But fortunately, the nice thing about the CRA is it is intended to cover all of the EU. So thankfully, that would be a step forward from the sort of harmonization perspective. But yeah, so.
Rob just touched on my next question, but if anyone else wants to add to that, the next question was, how difficult is it for organizations to deal with these disparate regulations that are requiring different timelines? Anyone want to add to that?
It's really tough. It's tough and it's expensive. I think a lot of folks have noticed since COVID, a lot of companies have laid off a lot of people, and so when you're down to a team of one trying to do all the communications and the external reporting, and you've got people coming at you from multiple different places. So each one of your customers may be saying, hey, am I impacted? Am I impacted? Am I impacted? I see this thing. Am I impacted? And you're saying, let me just deal with the government over here because they're asking me if they're impacted, while you're trying to actually do the mitigation of the actual incident. So to stop that from happening, you have to hire a field team. You have to hire somebody who's going to be that person who receives those responses and actually goes through it and responds appropriately. But that person is probably not going to be a technical expert, which means they're going to be the ones coming back to you saying, are they impacted? Are they impacted? Are they impacted? And you have to say, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, maybe. Oh, let me go actually finish this thing that I was working on trying to mitigate. As you add complexity in the different regulations and standards, you lack that harmonization. Now you have to have multiple people who understand each one of the standards, because it's highly unlikely you're going to have one person who can know all of the standards for all of the organizations across the globe. So you're going to have regional teams that do each one of these things at another level. That just adds that incident responder who previously only had to answer to one comms person who's asking them, are they impacted? Are they impacted? Is now answering to 10. Because everyone's got the same questions. So it adds a lot of extra complexity, which adds a lot of extra cost, which adds a lot of extra opportunities for things to go badly, and for things to get missed or dropped or just overlooked in the process. The need for speed versus the need for quality. You can't always have both.
And I guess one other comment on the harmonization piece is, I'd say the CRA becomes sort of a de facto standard in the way that we've seen kind of the GDPR in the data protection space. Well, different jurisdictions outside the EU may implement something that's very similar to the CRA, but has differences, and that adds complexity. So now you have a reporting requirement that has a slightly different threshold in 5 different jurisdictions, and that's something you will have to deal with as a responder and in complying with these different vulnerability reporting requirements.
So far we've talked about the CRA, we've talked about China's regulation. We also have FISMA, and then France's military programming law also requires the same thing. What does vulnerability reporting harmonization even look like? How do we get there? What should governments be doing to help us get there?
I'll start. So I think that there is a wonderful desire for timelines, and timelines are great, and they add a wonderful checking mechanism. But I would prefer to see gates versus timelines. Somebody decided 45 days was a good timeline, but that was an arbitrary assignment based on nothing, based on someone's feelings. I know you wrote it. You'll forgive my playful jabs against art here. We worked together for many years. So those 90-day, 45-day, these timelines like this, they're something to latch on to, but they often don't have any context in reality. What's the difference between 90 days and 91 days, right? Or 45 days and 46 days, 47 days. So I think it's good to have this should be done in a timely manner, and there should be consequences if it's not done in a timely manner. But I would love to see more developed gates versus like arbitrary timelines. That's kind of my first suggestion. I don't know if you guys have any other.
I guess one other suggestion is to, if you are going to have a mandatory reporting requirement, you make it after mitigation is available. I think that is likely a reasonable way to start harmonizing these things.
I would definitely +1 after mitigations are available for the reporting requirement. I think, there are some good things in the CRA around how it's trying to make sure manufacturers allocate resources to do vulnerability response. And I think that's a good approach, and trying to make sure manufacturers follow through on that. I think the the whole process of vulnerability response is a little bit murky for for legislatures and policymakers. And I think explaining how that process works in a way that's clearer from sort of the inside of it with the expertise all of you have could be really beneficial. You know, I think we're all trying to address vulnerabilities in a risk-based manner. Active exploitation is something that certainly bumps up how it's viewed in terms of risk. Those types of things and thinking about it that way would be really helpful for legislation, making sure the resourcing is there, making sure that it's communicated, that patches need to be available. I think sometimes, though, they want to help improve cybersecurity, but they don't always think through all of the implications. For example, the CRA has a mandate that if it's sort of expected, like it's not an industrial setting or a factory floor, that automatic updates would happen by default for products. That's good, but do we want every product designed to do auto update on its own and then have IT departments or users try to deal with sort of a haphazard update of different applications at different times based on their own model and system? You know, there could be opportunities to kind of standardize things and think about what's the lowest friction way for customers using technology to be able to stay as secure as possible, and look at it from the overall ecosystem benefits that are possible, as opposed to kind of individual solutions of problems that they've seen and heard from different customers. And so I think if legislatures could take a holistic view about what will increase cybersecurity overall, maybe that doesn't give them the best insight into what unmitigated vulnerabilities are out there in the short term, but overall it has a greater increase for cybersecurity as a whole. That should be the goal.
I'll add one more thing just because I want to put my shameless plug in before we like start taking questions, I think. But I think the part of the bigger reason that we do things like this panel right now is to help raise awareness. I will guarantee that almost all of you work for companies that have a global government affairs office or a legislative affairs office that is looking at these policies and regulations. And there's probably a good chance that you can contact those parts of your own company and say like, hey, this doesn't make any sense, and here are the reasons why. And that can make it into the comments that go back to that organization that's putting out that standard or regulation. That feedback is important because there's a good chance that that government affairs office or legislative affairs office that's part of your company doesn't have the subject matter expertise that you do. And so it's important to be able to provide that feedback at a technical level so that it's being explained in a way that is beneficial to the community as a whole. And so that's part of the big, call to action is understand if your organization has the ability to provide comments back. Many organizations are part of groups that industry groups that band together in coalitions that provide comments back to national level standards or legislative bodies. And so there is almost always an opportunity for you to do that. There's also things like the National Register or DEFCON policy where there's opportunities for people at a very tactical level to provide information back to policymakers directly. And that's a very, very needed thing. People can't do it on their own. It's got to be a community effort.
I'd certainly agree with that, but also point out that as experts working with CSIRTs, providing feedback directly to experts that are inside the government or can influence the government indirectly at an expert level is really helpful, because I think a lot of the legislatures are really concerned about the risk with digital products. They want to do something. And so having the experts within their own government offer recommendations to solutions about the best way to do that at the expert level is really helpful too.
Okay. Any questions? I want to make sure we have enough time for questions.
So we do have one question from an online participant. Please note, we're trying to take these in the order that they were received. We probably have more than we would get to, but I will ask this first one that was asked online. One of the main tenets of CVD is reduce the harm. However, that sentence or tenet seems incomplete considering there are many stakeholders, including, for example, government, national security, end users, etc. So her question is, for whom are we trying to reduce the harm?
It seems very obvious to me, but maybe I missed something. The end user, like you're trying to reduce the harm to the entire ecosystem and the end user. Like I don't want my Nana's bank account to get hacked, and I don't think anyone else does either. So, I mean, understand that the tenets of coordinated vulnerability disclosure were written by people who were doing the best they could to provide a vision and a mission statement that could have overarching guiding principles. They're not an instruction manual. There's some instruction there, but the tenets are meant to be kind of this overarching guidance and aspirational language. I think everybody's goal is to protect the end user and to protect each other, right? That's the goal of reducing harm. End users, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. End users, absolutely.
+1.
Any other questions in the room?
What other mechanisms do we as professionals have at the maybe individual level to contribute to these conversations? Like maybe you're not going to go for some reason you feel you weren't able to, or your company doesn't have an organization. Are there any things we can do individually in order to contribute to this conversation?
I mean, I would just like to compliment all of the work all of you are doing. I think clear definitions for how to talk about the problems and response is helpful. Explaining what support means and when things are out of support or in support is helpful. Providing transparency in what the vulnerability response process is are all things that are going to help the problem space. I think, at least in my experience, as we worked on this with legislatures, they did sort of grasp around to find definitions that were persistent over time they could grab onto and use to try to address things like, is it malicious activity or is it a security researcher's report? I think also explaining how the CVE process works and the fundamental basis of protecting the users is the ultimate goal is something that I think governments sometimes lose track of as they try to focus on, what does support mean? What is a vulnerability? What does the manufacturer have to fix? And when should they be doing X, Y, and Z and what their schedule is? I think, all the work that many of you do to provide clarity to what the process should be and communicating that outwards with definitions and terminology and mechanisms to assess vulnerabilities about whether they're going to have an impact or not to best predict what the manufacturer should do are really important. So thank you for all of that.
Yeah, just building off that, I was going to say becoming involved in working groups and organizations like FIRST to share your expertise, very helpful. And then there's the old call your congressperson. if it's of that much personal interest to you, you can make your voice heard, and it may not move the needle entirely, but it will raise the awareness of that particular issue that's passionate to you, to your particular legislator.
Yeah, I'll just add to the call your congressman. Every U.S. congressman's contact information is posted publicly and on the internet. So you can find them, and they want you to find them for the most part. There are also other initiatives that are a little easier to access. Things like there's an initiative called Hackers on the Hill, which every year brings together congressional representatives and security researchers to have an honest conversation, a Chatham House Rules conversation. So just, it's a shameless plug. I'm an organizer on that as well. But, we had 22 different congressional representatives speak with over 150 hackers in January of this year. This has been going on for 5 years. That's a direct contact between security researchers and congressional parties. And we're talking about like the Committee for Emerging Technology and AI, the banking and industry, healthcare industry committees. They're soliciting information they want, the information they want to understand. And so it takes a little bit more effort, but I think there are some mechanisms that are there to help facilitate those conversations.
Hi, Jim Duncan, independent. You can tell I've been binge watching Ted Lasso. I wanted to provide some perspective. I realized over lunch, I know some stories that have never really been public. And this one, I won't go into the fine details of the vulnerability because I actually don't remember which one it was. But in the early 2000s, I was the first full-time PSIRT person at Cisco. And we had a quasi routing and router vulnerability for which there was no pragmatic workaround, which was basically the axe of death on the core of the internet. And we had to get it fixed. And ISPs don't just run cold code. They got to test it first. By the way, 180 days is the minimum reasonable amount of time for remediation. And so we had to mobilize and get the fixed software had to be available via the internet. So if the core was out, we were screwed. And unfortunately, this is not the only incident like this that happened in my time there, but we had to get the fix deployed into as many backbone routers as we could quickly. And a couple lessons learned. Most organizations would go to their sales and customer support organization and you'd have them reporting back, fix my greatest customer sort of thing. We couldn't do that. It was a multi-vendor issue. Although I think we were principally the largest part that was affected. We identified the top participants in the core using Kim Clappy's data from CADA. So we went completely third-party, research-oriented. This is what's really happening. Use that to identify, I think, the top 50 connections to the core. Briefed the sales engineering and customer support engineering staff for those customers. They became the boots on the ground. They would physically go to each one of these customers and brief them and then get the fix installed. And it worked amazingly well in a 24-hour period. The one major hiccup was that there was one customer in Western Europe who knew a secret and couldn't keep his mouth shut and picked up the phone and called his counterpart on the other side of the submarine cable in New Jersey. And that team that arrived there, instead of being treated as heroes, they were excoriated before they even got into the lobby of the building. But that was unfortunate. But I bring all this up just to point out, you guys have come a long way. I mean, the improvement over that kind of stuff, I can't tell you the number of people who bailed out of teamwork on that just because they had indigestion and were, I had people just freak out at the stress of trying to deal with that stuff. This is a massive improvement. And then if we have a moment, I want to pivot from that.
We have 1 minute left, so.
So I pivot to a different thing. I made a proposal on this, but it wasn't enough to fill an entire session. There's a huge gap in the reporting issue, and that is where you have an independent employee at one company discovers a flaw in another company's product, and they don't have a good avenue or are not aware of a good avenue for reporting that. They go straight to that outfit. It gets nasty. And I have seen over my time, I've seen circumstances where members of board of directors are making phone calls and, shutting people down and other stuff. I want to develop a model where it's expected that you go to your own PSIRT team. If you have one, they go to that other PSIRT team and they handle it because they're going to expedite it. They know how to deal with the information. They know about TLP and other stuff. And I would like to start a group to popularize that and try to get the awareness built up around doing that. If you're interested, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the comments.
All right, we want to thank Kathleen, Michael, Rob, and Tanvi for a great speaker presentation. And if you want to stay in this room, the next topic will be elevating security standards, Intel's integration of common security advisory with Julia and Mike. Thanks everybody for their participation.
Thank you.